you a bit. And it's my pleasure to introduce Leila Wehbe. She is an assistant professor in the machine learning department and the Neuroscience Institute at the Carnegie Mellon University. Previously, she was also a postdoc researcher at the Helen Wills Neuroscience Institute at the UC Berkeley, working with Jack Garland. She obtained her PhD from the machine learning department at the Carnegie Mellon University, where she worked with Tom Mitchell. She studied language representation in the brain when subjects engage in naturalistic language tasks by combining functional neuroimaging with the natural language processing and machine learning. Today, Leila, she is going to talk about can human brain recording help us design better AI models? Without further ado, let's just welcome Leila, and the floor is yours. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay.
We can see it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Leila, and I'm in the machine learning and the neuroscience machine learning department and the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And I work at the intersection of neuroscience and AI and machine learning. And today I'm going to talk to you about whether human brain recordings can help us design better AI models. And I'm going to say more about both human brain recordings that I'm thinking about and also what kind of models I'm going to say about. But in general, I'm really, really excited about this idea, where I'm also excited about the time we are in right now, because there's so many different ways that we can kind of crosstalk, collaborate between, on one side, disciplines like machine learning, AI, natural language processing, computer vision, etc. And on the other side, neuroscience, and more specifically cognitive neuroscience, in which we study high-level cognitive processes like language, vision, etc. And there's actually many ways in which these fields already interact. One of them is to basically use tools from machine learning in order to analyze data in cognitive neuroscience. Because the data from cognitive neuroscience is actually pretty high dimensional and does require a lot of evolved algorithms. The other direction here is actually to use models from AI, for example, NLP models or computer vision models as models for the brain. So model the brain as, for example, a convolutional neural networks when it's looking at images, and try to use the representations from the convolutional neural network to understand which area in the brain is processing what level of visual information. And finally, the last direction, and also the most elusive direction, is actually to go from neuroscience and improve AI. So try to get some insight for better algorithms that are closer to what the brain does, and that might be, just better at AI tasks and better for doing whatever tool we want to do that humans already have. And actually, if we just look at what happened in the domain of vision, we can actually see all these interactions at play. So back in the 60s, neuroscientists started discovering that cells in the cells in the visual system were organized in a hierarchical fashion, such that cells that were upstream in the hierarchy were able to combine information from cells that were downstream in the hierarchy. So here, the cells that were more downstream detected simple patterns like center surround pattern, and the cells that were upstream were able to combine those patterns to detect lines. And that discovery in 1962 was a lot of work was built up on it. And we now understand that the visual system is actually a hierarchical system, especially in the first few stages. And every area is just building on the information that's computed in the previous areas in a hierarchical fashion. And that has led to inspiration in the AI domain. So starting in 1980, people started building hierarchical models for visual processing. And of course, that eventually became the convolutional neural network. And in 2012, there was a deep learning revolution. And now there's been so much progress in deep learning in computer vision that actually can be, there's so much progress that can be thought of as taking insight from the brain to improve machine learning and AI. But because of this progress also, neuroscientists started to actually take inspiration from AI, and they started using these AI models, these same convolutional models, as a model for visual processing in the brain. And so you can see now it's kind of come full circle. So now we're using in progress in AI and machine learning to inform the brain. So it's really kind of, because these domains are kind of studying the same thing, in this case, they're both studying vision, it makes a lot of sense that they interact with each other, and tools from one domain are used to help the other domain. But the way that neuroscience can help AI is actually very broad. So you can think, and people are thinking about this interaction at many, many levels. So for example, you can look at actual neuron circuits and try to build something that is more like that. Like, for example, with the work that was done in the visual system, figuring out the hierarchy, for example. You can think of things that are much higher, more abstract level, like, for example, what is the objective function that the brain is trying to solve? Can we actually build another system that optimizes the same objective function? There's also many other levels at which you can think of the inspiration between the brain and AI. But this particular talk is actually about human brain recordings, and more specifically, or more generally, about cognitive neuroscience. So can we actually take recordings of humans when they are in the scanner and doing things just naturally as they would do in everyday life? So for example, listening to a story or watching a movie. And can we take those recordings and try to use them as a source for building better AI? So these recordings are not going to be at the neuron level. They are non-invasive. They're going to be at the whole brain level, and they're going to be a trace of the different processes that are happening in the brain. So as the brain as we are watching a movie, for instance, in our brain, we're going to kind of perceive the different parts of the movie and have a specific representation of them. And in different areas, we're going to have a representation basically of different resolution, or like a representation, either like a very simple representation or a high level representation, depending where we are in the brain. And the brain activity we're measuring is just a byproduct of these representations. And the question is, will this brain activity help us to build better AI? Because it's basically a trace of what the brain is representing. The idea is we can take our AI algorithms and force them to have more similar representations to what the brain is doing. And the way we do that is by using the brain activity. So when I'm thinking about brain activity recordings, as I mentioned, I'm thinking about recordings from an experiment in which people are doing something complex and natural they would do in everyday life. So I'm not thinking of a very controlled experiment in which we have just a few stimuli and we show, for example, one stimulus and we collect brain activity, and then another and we collect brain activity. Here, really the stimulus can be a continuous stream. For example, here you can think of somebody lying in the FMRI scanner and reading a chapter from a book, in this case, Harry Potter, for instance. And here every word is presented on its own, and then they're just presented continuously. And meanwhile, the FMRI machine is recording the activity at every point in time. So this is the temporal resolution is slow in fMRI. In this case, it's recording one brain image every 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds, it captures this snapshot. So here I'm showing you the brain inflated a bit and open so that we can see both sides, the left and the right. And every pixel here is a 3D pixel. We call it the voxel or volume pixel. And what we obtain from these experiments is actually, you can think of it as a time series of stimuli and a time series of brain recordings. And this is just an example with reading, but you can have many other tasks in the scanner. You can have even people maybe produce language or engage in a conversation. You can make them watch a movie, even play video games. All of those can be basically done in the scanner as long as the subject does not move their head. And so after you collect this brain activity, the bet here we are making, this topic or the philosophy behind this talk, is that if you build an algorithm and you constrain it to predict the brain activity, for example, it could be a language algorithm that is reading the same text that the subjects are reading. So if it's also constrained to predict the brain activity related to this text, then it will get some bias or some knowledge that will make it better at the task it's trying to do. So if it's a language model, it will become a better language model. Another example is if it's a visual model, so like, for example, a ConvNet that's processing some images. If you constrain it with brain activity of people watching images, then maybe it just becomes better at its task. Becomes, for example, a better classifier, or it could maybe be more generalizable, for instance. Okay. So the core idea here is that in order to predict this brain activity, the AI model, will have to implicitly pick up on some of the computations performed by the brain. For example, if we have a language model and we're trying to predict the brain activity, we have a lot of brain activity of humans reading something. There are some things in, like, the way that the brain is processing language is going to make it react differently to specific forms of sentences. And in order to predict the activity related to reading those sentences perfectly, the algorithm has to, it has to figure out what are these computations that the brain is performing. And some of those computations, or being forced to perform these computations, will create some additional constraints which will not be there if we just train the model on corpus data without this brain activity. And by incorporating these kind of computations that the human is doing that are not necessarily easy to learn from corpus of data, hopefully we will arrive at a better solution, at a better AI algorithm. And when we say better, this can be better in many ways. For example, we can have better accuracy. We can have a more efficient algorithm, maybe a smaller algorithm, for instance. We can also perhaps create algorithms that are more generalizable and less brittle. So let me just give you a bit more detail on what I mean by predicting brain activity, so that we can talk about these different experiments after that. So basically, when we think about predicting brain activity, we think of something that the subject is doing at a particular time. So for example, reading a few words and the related brain activity. So here in fMRI, there's a bit more complexity in terms of time, because there's a slow response to everything that's happening on the screen. But I'm not going to go into these details now. They're easy to account for. We can talk about them another time. So basically what we're doing, we have basically a row of voxels at every point in time, a row of activity, and we would like to predict it or to relate it to the input stimulus. So it's hard. I mean, for example, here in this case, there are maybe 50,000 words in English. It's hard to see how, you could just like build a model that just directly relates the words to the corresponding activity. But one thing we can do is we can, for example, instead of thinking of the specific words, we can represent the words in a specific feature space. In this case, the feature space is just a toy syntax space that indicates at this particular point in time what kind of parts of speech do you have. For example, you have one pronoun and two verbs in this particular point in time. And if you encode your entire experiment in this way, what you will end up with is basically a matrix of what occurred at every point in time in terms of syntactic features, and a matrix of brain activity. And you can actually build a model that predicts one from the other. And so the predictive modeling approach we use here, we're talking about, kind of relates the stimulus to the brain activity. by basically replacing the stimulus with a feature space and then building a predictive model of the brain activity at every point in time. So here, importantly, every voxel in the brain or every output is predicted independently from the feature space. And just because we build a predictive model, of course, doesn't mean that this model is good everywhere. So in order to test it, we take a held out portion of the experiment, so a part of the experiment that we did not train on. And we take the syntactic properties for this particular held out passage, and we use the model that we trained. So for every voxel, for this particular voxel A, I'm going to predict the data related to reading this passage at that particular voxel. And then I can compare it to the real data that was acquired. And here, in this case, for example, if the voxel I was looking at is somewhere, let's say, in the motor cortex, so it's not really being modulated by the language signal, it doesn't really care about syntactic features, then I'm not going to be able to predict it well. On the other hand, in some other region, maybe actually it is a syntactic region, it's processing syntactic information, and I have good enough data to model this particular voxel's activity really well. And I can just kind of compute, one way I can just assess how well I'm modeling the activity is by computing correlation. So here I'm showing you only like 4 time points of test data, but of course we have much more test data in the real experiment. So after I compute the correlation and I run the proper statistical tests, if I find that actually in this particular voxel, I'm predicting very well, have a high prediction performance using these syntactic features I was talking about earlier, then that will suggest to me that actually this particular voxel, voxel A, is representing syntactic information. Right, so this is the tool that I use in order to kind of just uncover different forms of representation, different information that's represented in the brain. Now we're just going to use this throughout the talk. So basically I replace the stimulus with a feature space. Depending on which feature space I choose, I actually change my hypothesis. So instead of using, for example, syntactic feature space, I can use semantic feature space. If I'm looking at another type of experiment, I can use, for example, different layers from a network, etc. And I build a predictive model at every region in the brain, and I see where is this predictive model accurate. And so, for example, this feature space, if it's end up, for example, predicting well in this region in the brain, then I can say something about what this region might be representing. And more recently in language, especially with the the recent very popular and very well-performing language models that are neural networks, it's become quite like the task of predicting language or brain activity related to language has become, much better. These models, for example, here, this is a bidirectional LSTM, ELMO. ELMO is and other big language models are actually a pretty good model of the brain. They're able to predict the brain very accurately. But you can also choose basically at which level of ELMO to extract brain activity in order to predict the brain. I'm not going to go into the details now, but basically, for example, if you choose this particular region or this particular layer of ELMO, which is basically the forward part of this bi-LSTM, and it's kind of the second layer, meaning this particular part of the network contains information both about the current word and the previous words, but not the words that are coming up. If you use basically this context-dependent representation of the word, you can map it to a specific brain region and say, okay, this region seems to be representing both the word and its context, but you also have to compare it maybe what happens if you just take the word and not its context. Would you still be able to predict this region? And by doing these different kinds of experiments, you can say something about what this region is representing. So this was just a quick preview of this, course associating different feature spaces with different brain regions. But now let's go back to the assumption very quickly that we made before we opened the subject, which is that if you take an algorithm, maybe that's already trained, or an algorithm like a language model, and you change this model so that it performs better at this task, then this model might learn some knowledge that would make it better. And as we said, the idea is it will capture some computations that the brain is doing that it cannot learn just from a data set. It will incorporate these computations and perhaps arrive at a better solution. Okay. So this is the main idea. We're going to see whether aligning the models with the brain will help basically improve our AI models, or even try to interpret them better in terms of what different parts are doing. But in the second part, we're going to also see the other direction. So how we can use these different AI models to understand the brain better. And the last step will be kind of more like looking forward step, where we think about basically evolving both our knowledge of the brain and our AI algorithms at the same time. In the first one, where we're trying to get insight from the brain in order to improve AI, I want to talk about this work from my student Maria, who asked. So in this work, we were asking basically, instead of taking these networks and telling us something about the brain, what if actually the brain can tell us something about these networks? So there's a relationship or correspondence between different regions of the brain and different layers of a network, let's say. But we know a little bit about the brain. We don't understand it, obviously. We don't understand it fully, but we know some things about it. And so maybe that knowledge we have of the brain can actually like go back and improve our understanding of what the algorithms is doing. So here in this case, I'm going to talk about a transformer. In this case, it's BERT, where here every layer is basically a representation of the input sequence, but this representation is kind of differently recomputed at every layer using a large set of weights that are learned over a very large corpus. And importantly, in a transformer, we have a concept called self-attention. Here at every layer, the self-attention is just a different way of recombining the words around a specific word at this particular layer, depending on the word itself. Okay, so however, while attention is a very important part of transformers, it's not always understood, and people have tried to create different ways of understanding what these different attention heads in a network are actually doing. And so what we wanted to do is we want to see basically how important is attention at every layer of this network. And what we did is we removed, basically, we thought, okay, let me just remove every, the layer, the self-attention that's learned at every layer, and just replace it with a uniform attention. So in some sense, we're breaking the network, and we're going to see like, where does removing the network, removing the attention from the network, at which layer does it hurt the ability to predict the brain the most? And the idea is that that's where the attention is the most important according to the brain. So here, what I'm showing you in this graph is the ability to predict brain activity with different context length after I actually remove the attention. So it should decrease, right? So especially when you look at large contact length, if I, for example, in this particular line that corresponds to one of the layers, in that particular layer, I get hurt by more than 1% on my ability to predict brain activity after I remove the attention and I replace it by uniform attention. So that all makes sense. We're just breaking it and trying to see where does it hurt the ability to predict the brain the most. But what we didn't predict is actually over here. So here we saw that actually we get an improvement when we break the network by removing the attention in basically the first 6 layers. For layers 1 to 6, breaking the network in this fashion actually made it better at predicting brain activity. So this is just this weird task that we have kind of come up with, right? So we're taking a layer from a network, we're removing the attention, and then we're predicting brain activity. And actually, you get better by removing what the network has learned. So maybe we started thinking, oh, maybe this learned attention is not necessary in all the layers. Maybe it's actually not helping in layer 1 to 6. And so we made a bet, is that, and this is the same as like basically the entire thesis of this talk, which is that if if we actually make this network more aligned with the brain, more similar to the brain, so we kind of change it so that it predicts brain activity better, then that will lead to a better network. So we actually took BERT and we removed, again, the attention from every layer. And we tried to see this network with, like, you know, the missing attention from different layer, how well does it perform with respect to the base algorithm over here. With all the original attention. And we saw that actually in the first 6 layers, if you do remove the attention, you do get better at this set of syntactic tasks. These are like syntactic probe tasks that are used to basically detect how well BERT is at kind of understanding these different syntactic concepts. It's just a set of classification tasks. And actually, if you remove the attention from layer 1 to 6, we saw that actually you improve in significantly in 8 of those 13 tasks. And for the rest of the tasks, we're just at parity. But if you remove the attention from the later layers, you don't get better, you get worse. And this is what we were seeing also with the brain. So in some sense, the ability of BERT to map or to predict brain activity was actually similar to its, you know, performing in real life on language tasks. So changing it in order to make it predict brain activity better actually led to it being a better language model, which is a pretty cool thing. I mean, it's more of a proof of concept experiment, but it's the first of its kind specifically in language. So it's the first time that one can use one. To our knowledge, it's the first time that somebody has used brain activity in order to improve a language model and make it perform better at language tasks specifically. But again, this is a proof of concept experiment. But it's the first indication that basically going and making your algorithm closer to the brain makes it a better language model. And it's not a solved problem yet, but it seems promising. And actually, more recently, this paper, for example, saw that proposed an alternate model to transformers, but also saw that actually, if you looked at the early layer of transformers, they're basically acting more like averaging layers rather than attention, self-attention layers. So this kind of corroborated a little bit what we are proposing, which is pretty exciting. So this was the first direction in which we were trying to use the brain to interpret and improve AI. But we can talk about basically going the other way as well, unless anyone has any questions.
So actually, I have one question related to the first part. And then you're using those embedding coming from some deep learning model to predict brain activity. I wonder, these are more like a language task, understand individual words. How about other things such as logical reasoning? I don't know whether there's a corresponding kind of a question here. Yeah. For instance, maybe graph neural nets working with knowledge graph or something like that. And then once you propagate, one step is like looking at the one relationship or things like this. And I wonder there will be some interesting question related to this. You look at the frontal cortex or something and see where the brain is trying to predict those activities. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question, definitely. I mean, we're definitely trying to move more toward these more interactive tasks in which you have to make decisions and interact with the environment. Yeah, or even reason, as you said. So in the kind of experiments that I've seen that do more logical tasks, you definitely get more frontal regions, and you do get there's an exciting experiment that I've seen of people playing video games, and then you can also take basically activations of a network that has learned to play the same video game, and like kind of map like basically the value, for example, of the different moves to the brain activity when those moves are taken, for instance. That's also pretty exciting. All of those are at least philosophically, they're all exciting, and it will be exciting to try. They become a little bit more difficult in implementing them, but I think maybe now is the time to be doing these kinds of experiments for sure.
Right. I see. Great. So actually there's another question. So someone asked, does the choice of language of the speaker whose brainwave are used for training affect the model chain? yeah, for instance, although this guy is reading English, maybe his native language is Chinese or something. I don't know whether the experiment has done to that detail. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's like a yes and a no, probably. So I think that so the experiments are being done right now, actually, by some of my collaborators, and I think there is something that is constant, probably like the innate meaning of what you're listening to. A lot of it is constant across languages. Of course, some languages have more emphasis on different meanings, but in general, it could be the case that the way we represent the meaning is the same in every language, and just the words map a little bit maybe differently on those meanings. So I think maybe if you translate the sentence and you still use the same approach, maybe it will still you'll still be able to model the brain activity related to another language. At the same time, if you have enough data and you want to really like fine-tune a model to really kind of detect differences, or to be really kind of capturing the intrinsic parts of or the really special things about one language, then definitely there will be something in the brain that's different for that other language, and you probably want to be doing these experiments in other languages. But it's just fascinating. Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, could you have the same subject to different languages in the scanner and try to kind of maybe use that in order to build better, better translation models, or to capture something like that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please go ahead with your second part.
Okay. All right, so in the second part, I'm just going to tell you about an experiment in which this was a visual experiment. And in this experiment, we were using neural networks again in order to basically predict the different regions in the brain when you view images. However, here, and you might have thought about this before, the task that you use to basically to train those convolutional neural networks will actually affect their representations a lot. And the question is basically, which task do you use in order to train a network, in order to use the network's representation to predict the brain? And basically, which task you choose might lead to basically a different understanding about the brain. So we based this work on this paper from Zamir et al. At CVPR 2018, which is called Taskonomy, in which basically the same network structure with the same encoding part, with the same layer size at the end, was trained for many tasks, I think 19 tasks. And then the same encoder was used to kind of basically solve the other tasks. And so what the authors measured here is the ability, basically the ability of the network trained at each task to solve these other tasks. So the representations that you fine-tune for one task, how good are they to solve the other tasks? And the idea is, if there's good transfer of these representations, so if you can train a model of one task and then be able to solve another task very well, then that means that these two tasks are similar to each other, and you can use basically these kind of similarities in order to build a hierarchy between the tasks, where you have a source task that is kind of more general than the other task that can be solved by kind of first solving this task. And by doing so, you can basically build this this hierarchy. So what we were interested in was to kind of take these networks that are trained on all these different tasks and just see if the representations we extract from them will predict different areas of the brain. So the idea there is that if a network trained on a specific task has representations that are pretty good for predicting a specific brain area, but not the other networks, then maybe this particular task is similar perhaps to the task that this particular brain region is doing, or it's optimized to solve. And so here we use two data sets. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show you results from both of them. And both of them are large data sets that have people sitting in a scanner for a very long time in different sessions, and just like looking at a very large number of images. So in both 5,000, that's 5,000 images, and NSD, that's 10,000 images. And these images are extracted from big visual data sets online, like for example, the COCO data set. And after the images are seen, the images are spaced. They have a few seconds between them of rest. Then the activity that's related to each image is taken and it's averaged. And so you get one brain recording for every image, and then you can just use the representation of each network for that image to predict the brain activity. And so this is what you get. Here I'm showing you actually the entire brain that's been not just inflated like we saw before, but also flattened, so opened up like this. And what I'm showing you here is basically the prediction performance using the representation from the network that was trained on object classification. Okay, so this is actually a pretty high correlation for fMRI. So here the regions that are over here are actually well predicted by the representation of the network, the object classification network. The regions over here are like primary visual cortex. They're in the back of the head. This is the first region, the first area in the cortex that where the visual information goes. And then the information kind of goes outwards. And so these regions over here are high-level visual regions. For example, place regions over here, and there's face region over here, etc. And the regions that are more over here are more frontal. So this particular experiment included the memory task. So that's why some of those high-level regions were also engaged. Okay, so this is just one example of one of the network using that representation to predict the brain activity. We have a lot of results, but I'm going to show you the most striking one. So here, I'm going to show you the results of, this was just one network. This is two networks at the same time. I'm showing the results at the same time. So regions here that are in red are better predicted by the network that's trained to compute the 3D edges of an image. And the regions that are in blue are better predicted by the one that's trained to predict the 2D edges. And you can see there's not much in blue. And then regions that are in white are well predicted by both. So we can see here that the primary visual cortex is well predicted by both the 2D and the 3D edges. But actually the high-level visual cortex is more predicted by the 3D edges. And you can see this is actually constant across all the subjects in that experiment. And it's also true in the other data set, the first data set, the both 5,000 data set, which had a slightly different resolution. So you can see that the high-level regions over here, which are more on the outside of the visual system, those regions are also better predicted by the network that's trained to predict the 3D edges versus the 2D edges. And you can think, okay, what is different about the 2D edges and the 3D edges? So here, this is the original image. And you can see the network that's trained to predict the 3D edges is outputting this kind of a representation versus the one that predicts the 2D edges it is predicting something that has more edges and more pixels in some sense that have a color, but actually this particular information requires more. It requires more. Computing this require actually more processing and more high-level reasoning because you want to only detect the edges that correspond to the 3D information. And so it actually also makes sense that these high-level regions in the brain were also better predicted by the 3D edges here. And you don't have to just stop at 2D versus 3D. We actually can compare not just the networks or the different tasks to the brain. We can also compare between the tasks themselves on the brain. And so we can create basically a matrix that tells us how much these different tasks are similar according to the brain. And we can also construct basically like the original paper, which constructed a hierarchy between the tasks, and also kind of capture how does those tasks map on the brain, and is it similar to the taxonomy hierarchy? And more or less, we find that it's kind of broadly similar. Maybe some of the clustering, or we do get a different clustering, but some of it is similar. Specifically, we see that the object classification and scene classification are very different from the other tasks. They're like the first cluster that is very different. They're good for predicting most of the visual cortex. And the other tasks mainly cluster as things that are more related to 3D or things that are more related to 2D. And so in conclusion, we saw that actually like training the same network for different tasks could be useful for trying to discover like maybe or to create hypotheses about what task is different as a specific region's solving. And specifically, there seems to be a broad distinction, a very strong distinction between networks that are optimized for 2D tasks and 3D tasks. So this was the second direction, just to see kind of not only how we can use neural networks to predict brain activity, but how we can actually refine this by perhaps training the network on different tasks. But also we have other experiments in my lab in which we do other types of manipulations to the network in order to discover more things about the brain specifically. But before I end, I just want to talk quickly about this other direction, in which we don't think about AI and the brain as separate, but we actually try to train a model to predict brain activity right away, instead of just like training it to predict brain activity and then changing it, and then changing it, or training it to predict brain activity and then extracting its representation and predict. So I'm talking about training the model to predict brain activity instead of training it normally on a data set and then using its activation to predict brain activity. And so the idea here is that you just integrate brain activity into the model as it's training. So for example, in this particular paper, we used FMRI recordings, as I was talking about before. We also used MG recordings. So this is a different kind of a machine that records the changes in the magnetic field on the top of your head that are due to brain activity. So it's very noisy, but it's actually a very, very good tool for measuring like things that vary in time very quickly. Which is very different from FMRI. So it has a very high temporal resolution. So we had both FMRI and MG recordings of the same experiment in which people were reading a chapter of a book. So this was not a lot of text, and so we could not use it basically to train a network from scratch. But what we did is we took a pre-trained BERT and we just used this FMRI and MG data in order to fine-tune this pre-trained model and try to see, like, does fine-tuning this BERT model, does changing its weights to predict this brain activity better, does it lead to a better model? So instead of just like getting inspiration by trying out different things like we did in the first part of the talk, here we're actually immediately changing the weights in that model in order to, we're altering its weights in order to predict brain activity. And the idea is that if this model is going to perform better because it's fine-tuned on brain activity, then it's basically picked up something from the brain in its performance. So first, I'm going to show you some of the results. Also, just go over them quickly. So here in the first figure, I'm showing you the improvement in the performance of this model after it's being fine-tuned. And so here we've ranked the voxels from the best voxel to the worst voxel, and this is a log scale. And what I'm showing you here is the improvement at each voxel in classification, a specific classification task. It's a binary classification task. And so you can see for all the, and every color is a different subject. And and you can see that basically for all the subjects, after if you compare the fine-tuned BERT to the vanilla BERT that's not been fine-tuned, you can do better on all of the voxels. Basically, there's a great performance improvement. So the performance improvement is computed at every voxel. So we're still trying to predict brain activity here. And what we're saying is that if you fine-tune the model to predict brain activity, it becomes a better model for the brain activity, which makes total sense. This is not very impressive. It's just basically what we're doing here. It's just making sure that our approach has worked. But okay, let's see if this particular fine-tuned BERT is actually transferable. So here we're transferring to another subject. So I fine-tune a model on one subject and I transfer to the other subjects. And you can see that for all the subjects, except for this one subject, which has only a little bit of improvement, for all the subjects, just fine-tuning on another subject also leads to a great improvement in predicting data for the subject. So this is still fMRI. So here in the first thing we saw that if you fine tune on somebody's fMRI data, you become better at predicting its data, their data. If you fine tune on somebody's fMRI data, you become better at predicting somebody else's fMRI data. And the last one is we're kind of trying these different techniques out. So here we're fine tuning on MEG first, which is this other technique, and then we're trying to predict fMRI. So we fine tune on MEG, and then we fine tune on fMRI again. And so here we see that actually there's not that much transfer that happens when you go from MEG to fMRI. If you look here, this basically doesn't seem like there's improvement overall for all the subjects. But actually, if you look at the regions that are improving, which are the ones in the red, which are the red voxels over here, those regions correspond more or less to the language regions, which are here in green. So these are the regions that we think are involved in processing language. And we see here that even though if you look at all the voxels at the same time, it doesn't seem like there's an improvement, but actually the voxels that are improving are the ones in the language cortex. So, this led us to believe that actually we are able to basically transfer between the imaging modalities, that so go from MEG to fMRI, which is something that's been actually quite challenging in the literature. So that being said, even though we're able to kind of make BERT basically better able to predict brain activity, so because it's going even between fMRI and MEG, we're making it learn something about the brain, which is beyond just the fMRI modality or the MEG modality. We actually were not able to take this fine-tuned model and improve its performance on different NLP tasks. So this is still a kind of an unsolved problem, but at least we did not hurt its performance. So we just made it better brain aligned, but it did not solve this holy grail that we're after. But the goal is, maybe if we had enough data and not just the amount of data we have here, perhaps we would get actually a better model, a better transformer in this case. And the idea is by adding more and more data, as we said in the beginning of the talk, this will allow us to extract some of the principles that the brain is using to combine words together. And that might lead to these better AI models. Now, before I end, I just want to basically just mention some of the challenges that are inherent in this work, just so that it doesn't seem like I really believe that this is just going to be solved tomorrow. There's actually quite a few challenges in order to do this kind of transfer approach in which we're using information from the brain in order to improve our AI models. The first one, and maybe the one that I think doesn't really get appreciated enough, is that the brain activity is not just what you care about. It's not just, the representation of the stimulus. It's not just the activations in a network. It's actually everything. So it's not just noisy. It actually reflects everything that's happening in the brain. So, for example, something like how many words are you keeping in your working memory, or just the fact that you're seeing the words on the screen, all the information that's processed or passing in the brain, it's all being recorded in the brain activity. But for example, if you take a neural network and you just want to read out the activations, you go to the layer and then you extract the activations. You're not really imaging, the information as it's passing through the different nodes, as the computations are being done in the different parts of the network. So because of that thing, there's actually a lot of confounds that might arise that makes this endeavor harder. Another point is that we don't yet have enough brain activity to do these kinds of large scale experiments. However, the exciting part is that there's a lot being done on that front. There's a lot of data collection efforts that are being done, and hopefully soon we will have the amount of brain activity that we need to fine tune these models properly. I just also wanted to mention this other challenge as well. The other challenge is that this whole problem of predicting brain activity is underdetermined. For example, if a network can predict brain activity in an area A, does this mean that this network's activations do correspond to exactly the representations that this area is doing? And that's not necessarily the case, because predicting the same brain activity can be done in many ways. For example, some of the brain activity can just be predicted by low-level features that account for a lot of signal, but also the different transformation of the same feature space can still predict the activity very well because of correlations between those different representations. So for example, in the visual system, you can think that layer 3, for example, of a specific region predicts very well, but actually it's really the information that's in layer 2 that is a bit more similar to what this region is doing. But because layer 3 and layer 2 are very correlated, layer 3 is just a function of layer 2, then this just makes this whole procedure very difficult. And so just going forward, again, as I said, we need a lot of data, but we also need to be very careful and stay close to the science and all the hypotheses that we're making, just reevaluate everything that we're saying all the time. And also the other thing we have to keep doing is just keep basically this rich interdisciplinary dialogue, keep for people who work at this area, really you need to talk to both the neuroscientists and the AI people, and you need to basically be both of those people as well. So it's really, even though it's challenging, it's actually quite an exciting time for this particular field. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and thank you for the invitation. This was a very nice opportunity, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for the chat, for the talk. I think there are already some questions, additional questions in the chat, I believe. Where can I find the questions? I think one question is already answered. Someone asked to understand the brain, is there a brain to computer software that show which brain neuron is activated? Right. And since we have 86 billion neurons located in the different regions. So in your talk, you mentioned about FMRI, which measure the activity in Warsaw level, probably slower in terms of temporal resolution. MEG is having higher temporal resolution, but lower spatial resolution. There may be other mode of, measuring brain activity. What's the difference between these different way of measuring brain activity, and can your result, for instance, generalize to different ways of measuring brain?
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, obviously, we are very limited by the physical properties of the brain. In most cases, we do not want to have invasive procedures, so we are, limited by the non-invasive procedures we have, which until now they don't have the ability to record from all the neurons, and you either get space basically or you get time, more or less. I mean, MEG also has a little bit of space, but really it's pretty limited. So one thing you might think of is like, can you benefit from actually using both fMRI and MEG at the same time, and kind of trying to combine both of them and just result in a better, higher spatial temporal picture of what's going on? So that's actually proves to be challenging, mostly because of the MEG, for example, having even a worse signal to noise ratio than fMRI. But it's still an exciting kind of machine learning problem, like how do you combine both of those together? But in more recent work, we've actually been seeing some really intriguing things, like we can actually see some things in fMRI, like for example, sustained information over a long period of time. So if you think about the context that gets accrued when you read a sentence, so the meaning of that sentence, that's a bit different from the meaning of the individual words in isolation. You can think of that, we call it the supraword meaning. Mm-hmm. So that actually is very visible in fMRI. But if you look at MEG, however, in MEG, MEG is very responsive to the meaning of the individual words. So most of the signal is just the individual words, but you cannot see in MEG this sustained meaning over many words. You do not see the supraword meaning. And we think it's because perhaps this other meaning is being kind of represented or maintained in a in another type of a neural process that doesn't really create that much MEG activity. So it's kind of missing from MEG, but people have not noticed this yet, or we're the first people to notice this because maybe people don't look at these kind of, like naturalistic tasks with a lot of information that's sustained. Yeah.
So could it be like FMI is in some sense, it's a lower temporal resolution. It measures some kind of cumulative effect. When we are trying to interpret a particular word, actually the context is like take a little bit of time to accumulate some sense. That's why it's not a short-term thing. It's like a maybe longer term.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good insight. I think we're gonna have to do something like that, like some maybe try to come up with a way to model it that takes into account these different computations and how they would happen. That is not what usually is done in a network. Like here, like what are the constraints on the system, and how is it combining the information, and how would that explain the different recordings that we get from different modalities?
Sounds cool. And also there's another question asking actually about the individual differences in this prediction or the brain activity. Can you say something about this?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So for most people who are healthy subjects, there's actually it depends on what you do. Like if you collect enough activity of people doing a task, if you're going to collect enough brain activity, you would start seeing that actually there's a lot of similarities between people at the fMRI level, and basically the same region get activated. There's a bit of anatomical variability, but there's also a lot of similarities between people. Now, obviously, we're all very different from each other, so maybe the differences between us are just not at these like broad, high level or gross kind of resolution that you get in fMRI. Maybe it's a bit more at smaller scale levels, those differences.
So could it be like in FMI, you see less variation compared to MEG? Of course, modulus, potential MEG is noisier. MEG is more faster, low level, feels like low level processing, and FMI is broader. And okay, right. So you have been talking mostly about the, this brain measurement level kind of data and inspiration to the deep architecture. Could this be combined with the anatomical structure of the brain somehow to together inform maybe how to improve AI model, things like this? For instance, there may be already some, or the other way around, there are already some previous study or anatomical study about how brain regions are connected, right? There are neural fiber kind of connecting different part of the white matter, and would those be helpful, for instance, to improve your prediction?
No, definitely. I think combining, I don't know if fMRI is going to be the tool, but maybe some other brain recording tool that measures function with structure might be able to maybe give you a better idea of like what is the graph of regions, more specifically like which region is connected to which, and how is the so not just like connectivity, but actually how is the information being passed between those different regions, and if you can get that sort of like more like a causal understanding a bit of these different regions with like a more detailed network, and I think that could be pretty useful. Probably, and like once you understand also what each node in this network is doing, perhaps you can use that as a baseline for maybe modifying existing models or creating new AI models.
Right, I see. So, so this you are in the talk you presented. You are studying mostly the human brain activity. How about other organisms? For instance, I know for some of the very simple organisms, such as C. elegans or something, they have mapping individual neuron. You can nowadays even record the activity of individual neuron. Can you, for instance, understand some kind of I don't know, activity prediction model or some temporal model correlated with the neural structure of these small organisms, things like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that so in those particular models, in those particular organisms, you definitely get, obviously you get all this high resolution in time. You can also intervene easier. I think people are trying to do the same kinds of approaches, and maybe not in the simplest of organisms, but maybe, for example, even in mice, people are trying to like, predict calcium imaging recordings from vision, let's say. Actually, things are a bit more complicated in those simpler organisms. Like, for example, in the primate visual system, you have this like nice organization in layers that maps onto the other models that we have. But in the mouse visual cortex, for example, things are a bit more all over the place, and we understand it even less because it's a bit more complex. Maybe not more complex in terms of more evolved, but like more not as well organized. So I think there's definitely a lot of promise there, but we just don't know about it as much as we do about, for example, primate vision. And so it's a bit more challenging. But there's definitely a lot of work in that area currently.
Great. So there's the last question related to maybe interaction between people, and how would you imagine such experiment can be done? And yeah, what kind of model machine learning model you can use, or once you understand the brain activity during human interaction, how would you be able to improve machine learning model?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So maybe it's easier to answer this question if you think of person-person interaction as like a language interaction. So maybe both people are in different scanners at the same time, or even maybe just one person is on the scanner, one person is outside the scanner, and you just study the person in the scanner. And while they're engaged in a conversation, perhaps you can have a model of what they are saying versus what the other person is saying. You can use maybe dialogue models. There's a lot of research in NLP on dialogue systems. So you could try to kind of, use some of those models to predict the brain activity, but you can also try to see like, is the person representing what they are thinking versus what the other person is thinking differently? Is it how do two people like arrive at a common understanding of something? How do they evolve together during the conversation? All of those would be quite exciting to study. And we've started actually running these kinds of experiments.
I see. Great. Yeah, it's still a frontier. Looks like there's a lot to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, even like challenges like methodologically and at the modeling level and even at the scanning level, like, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And actually, after we rest a bit, there will be a faculty session. They might have even more questions to you about this interesting topic. And if you have any question, you can also ask there. Awesome. But for now, thank you very much for the talk. And it's really a great talk.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.